In this revisited, refreshed episode of Lore Gear, we will take a look at one of the most iconic melee weapons used by the forces of the Imperium, and indeed many other factions of the galaxy in M41, the legendary Chainsword. Chain weapons in 40k are especially genre-defining, as they are such an unusual melee weapon. The most common representation is that of the chainsword, essentially a single-handed chainsaw in the design of a sword. As with many advanced Imperial melee weapons, it is also monomolecularly edged. This is an adjacent iteration to monofilament weapons. Blades with a monomolecular edge in the 41st millennium are designed to be able to cut with an impossibly sharp edge. And before we get further into the chain weapons, a point on that monomolecular technology. It's a very unique aspect of the 40k verse, although its origin is unclear and very debatable. Some point to the zenith of humanity during the age of technology as being when such a technology emerged, but given the fact that such precision and advancements sit far more comfortably within, say, the Eldari culture, and especially given that they use monomolecular technology in several very specific weapon systems not used by humanity and that are favoured by the Dark Eldar for their horrifying cults and torture covens, it seems at least plausible that it has some Xenos origin, although nothing to say that two different civilizations couldn't develop the same base technology. Regardless though, monomolecular tech still represents a pinnacle of human technological achievement in weaponry and remains of course widely used. Monomolecular blades are said to be composed with edges that are just one molecule thick, and are so incredibly sharp they can slice through armor, flesh and some of the toughest synthetic materials with little if any resistance. Many Imperial military departments are issued with blades using monomolecular tech, and the most notable of course being the Space Marines. All their blades will carry monomolecular edges that make the Adeptus Astartes lethal in close combat, swiftly cutting through enemies and armor. Monomolecular wire is considerably more horrific however. Physically razor thin and almost invisible. It's designed for use in various purposes, most often traps, anti-personnel, and a deadly tool for assassinations. It could be also used in, say, difficult to patrol perimeter security. Monomolecular filament weapons are most notably used by the Eldar Harlequins and Warp Spiders, who employ the use of these filament-type weapons so sharp that their victims may not even feel they've suffered an injury before they slop to the floor as a small pile of flesh and blocks. Their aspect warriors, known as the Striking Scorpions, are also seen to wield Scorpion chainswords, which are basically a more elegant Eldar design of chainsword. But given the Eldar race's extremely ancient origins and their artisan craftsmanship of armor, weapons and their entire culture, it makes it seem considerably unlikely that they would steal a design from what is, in their perspective, a fairly straightforward technology. Even less likely to wish to do so from a race so clumsy and brutish as humans in their view. The very thought of such would probably make an Eldar's stomach turn over. In many ways, monomolecular technology underscores the need for factions to continually develop technology in a galaxy racked by unending war, in a reality where everything is spun out to the most extreme measures just in order to survive, but also to dominate your enemies. Monomolecular blades illustrate the cold brutality of an era where only the strongest civilizations with the most brutal tools and weaponry can endure. Still, in saying all of that, as with many things in 40k, the science often requires some just a small incremental suspension of disbelief. Or to in fiction rationalise it, who can specifically say why or how these weapons do what they do? I guess we as the unwashed masses of a hive city will never be able to comprehend such things. From the perspective of the Imperium, of course, the concept of them having adapted any science or tech from Xenos is incomprehensible. So for them it's far more palatable that the origin of chain weapons were, as with most of humanity's technology, from the Dark Age of technology. Various magos within the Adeptus Mechanicus have dedicated decades of research into the origins of this tech, but are still yet to yield any solid conclusions. While it is used by many forces within the Imperium, the chainsword is not something unique to humanity, as we've already discussed. The Orcs, the Eldar, they all have iterations which likely predate the human version of chainswords. There are of course also other chain weapons like the chain axe, chain fist and even chain glaives. While not necessarily the most elegant of weapons other than in the hands of the Eldar, the chainsword brings a level of brutality that is significantly intimidating through both its sound and literal physical effect. These are not simply blades for stabbing or cutting through your enemy, but are far more likened to some kind of uncontrollable rabid beast, with the teeth of the chain weapon ripping through them in a rough, ragged mess, shredding them to pieces, chewing along the chain. So hardly a weapon designed to give a fast death to its victims, but that is surely the point. Instead, it will mangle and rip out the guts of its foes through a sustained period of suffering until finally releasing them in an appropriately harrowing state to any friendly nearby witnesses. Still, while this all might sound terrifying to a human civilian, it likely will be far less fear-inducing to the more alien enemies of mankind. So you might then rightly wonder, why factor in any sort of intimidation factor with the weapon's reputation and effectiveness? Well, because, as I find myself wanting to mention ever more often recently, across the Imperium humanity faces many enemies, but one of the most common is itself. Humans are one of the most commonly fought enemies in the galaxy of M41 for the Imperium and humanity. There are always those heretics, cultists and general human detritus to quell and violently quash. You will see many an Imperial Guard officer or sororitas wielding a chain weapon, and the sight of this and their effect can be more than enough to cause a rebelling citizenry of thousands to have second thoughts about just how committed they are to the cause. And while we're talking about the dregs of society, it's worth considering the status of chainswords as well. As with most things in the far future of humanity, some items hold a relatively uncommon or even rare status. Now, chainswords are no master-crafted weapons, although of course iterations of those will exist. They're still mass-produced as an armament of the Imperium, but they do have a more elevated status, more symbolic than your, say, average melee chopping weapon. Chainswords are often used by the Imperial Astartes, as well as Imperial Guard commissars, general officers, individuals of importance who may have taken on active combat roles, sororitas, etc, etc. Within the lower levels of society, you're only really going to see these kind of chain weapons when gang leaders, general hive criminals will get a hold of them to relish the status that such a weapon is going to bring to them, not to mention the potential intimidation they could wield by demonstrating its effectiveness upon captive rivals or bloody skirmishes, or perhaps in, say, prisoner exchanges. As with much of the tech produced by the Imperium, chainswords can come in a variety of different patterns, and that means variants that are largely the same but are slightly more powerful, more efficient, or in some cases a little larger or smaller. Chainswords will vary from single-handed lighter weight blades to heavy two-handed versions, and of course you've got chain axes, etc. My personal favourites though are those used by the Space Marine Terminators, who wield the immensely powerful chain fists, something akin to a power fist but with a large chainsword combined into it. A fantastically human innovation, taking two appalling things and putting them together. The massive double-handed chainswords, also known as eviscerators, are favoured by the ecclesiarchy, zealots, witch hunters, and some of the adepta sororitas known as the repentia. While obviously challenging to use, the sheer weight and power of an eviscerated chainsword is enough to rend a human, orc, and likely with much satisfaction a Tau, easily in half. These massive powered weapons can even rip through walls and deal some vehicle damage, but its large negative is of course that because it's a two-handed weapon, wielding a pistol or some other ranged tool is very often not an option, which limits the flexibility of its user in combat, not to mention the sheer encumbrance of such a vast weapon if you're anything other than a sororitas or an Astartes. Now, Space Marines may have their own specific iterations of chainsword designed to a chapter's own preferences and battle style. Some have very specific crafted designs, such as the Space Wolves' Kraken-tooth swords, whereby teeth are used from the Fenrisian sea monsters known as Ice Kraken. These can also be upgraded as Frost Blades, but these master-crafted and more specialist tools will not make up the bulk of weapons produced for the Astartes, where the most common standard pattern is the Mark 11 Hell's Teeth chainsword. Unsurprisingly, because of all the moving parts, chainswords require a fairly intensive level of maintenance, holy oils, prayers, blessings, so a quick wipe down isn't going to cut it with a combat tool this complex. Thankfully, it is not a comparatively complex weapon in the grand scheme of things, and shouldn't require anything like the highly skilled incense-burning abilities of a tech priest to return it to full working glory. For chain weapons, even a fairly straightforward underhive ganger, damaged or no, should be able to clean and restore a chainsword to a pretty reasonable state of functionality. Within the ranks of the Astartes, those serfs should be more than ready to restore and prepare chainswords for their masters' next battle victims, again through a whole process of rituals and treatment for the weapon. But thankfully, spares and replacements for chainswords very easily available, the teeth in and out of combat environments. While they will initially readily cut through armour, this is of course going to wear over time, and so replacements are going to be needed in a pretty short period, especially against armoured enemies. But a skillful Space Marine will aim always for the weak spots in between the layers of armour to maximise the effective ability of the weapon and prolong its durability. For Imperial Guard officers, if they're facing human rebellions or dealing with some crazy gangers, this is going to be less of an issue, cutting through simple fabrics and flesh, but facing down hordes of chitined, tyrannid or plated orcs is a different matter. Plus, when it comes to wielding a chainsword, while it may appear savage and brutal, simply hacking and slashing away at your enemy is going to be, for one thing, less effective, and two, likely breaking the teeth and ruining the chain on it more quickly. So chainswords do require some combat skill. They're going to do their best work with skilled thrusts into weak areas and precision sweeping strikes. When in one-on-one melee combat, using the flat-backed edge of the chainsword as well can parry and block, which is essential if you're wanting to maintain the combat effectiveness of the weapon. Striking blade to blade as you might with a sword, or simply blade to melee weapon, or even blades to armour, is going to again increase the danger of ruining, breaking teeth in the chainsword. Then of course there's the fuel consideration, because yes, what did you think was powering them? Now, some mastercrafted or special iterations may have a self-sustaining generators, again more advanced like the Eldar may have this, but for humans most are going to require pretty basic fuel, no differently than any other Imperial tech. They even have exhausts on the blades themselves. Some crazy iterations of the chainswords include double-edged variations known as Mercy chainswords, and these are simply adapted by removing the protective rear flat back to the standard sword. But they're often longer as well. Usually the intention is to swing the blade so as to strike any target within reach, so hardly a precise combat strategy, but depending on your enemy, potentially doubling its efficiency. As with most weapons in the far future, many have gained individual notoriety, one such being Storm's Teeth. This massive chainsword was wielded by the Imperial Fist's Primarch Rogor Dawn, and it was said to have been fashioned before the Emperor rediscovered Dawn on his homeworld of Inuit. This powerful sword is simply known as being one of the most faithful and prized weapons used by the Primarch, and as such holds high status within the Imperial Fists and Imperial Relics. Another famed weapon is the Blood Reaver, used by Chapter Master Gabriel Seth of the Flesh Tearers, a small second founding from the Blood Angels as we talked about in a video recently. This prized weapon within the chapter is a massive two-handed chainsword, nearly twice the size of its standard variant. Such a weapon could only be wielded effectively by an Astartes, such as the Chapter Master, and using such a giant weapon can inflict massive damage, swinging at 360 degrees and literally tearing through any enemies in its path. An appropriately signature weapon for the fearsome Flesh Tearers chapter, hence why it is such a renowned status as a relic weapon. Chainswords in the 41st millennium really are an excellent analogy for the savagery of unending war that exists. It's not enough to simply beat your enemy into submission, but it is essentially required that in doing so you inflict as much pain and suffering and trauma in the process. Few other weapons are going to be able to inflict the raw brutality as a chain weapon, that once they've caught a bite of an enemy will ravenously continue to feed on its victim until it's bitten all the way through. Far from an elegant or surgical melee weapon then, but a chainsword is going to shred its way through flesh and bone, leaving them immediately in a state of agony and more importantly shock. And whilst other melee weapons, power swords, etc. can be more or less effective depending on their user's strength or skill, the one significant advantage with a chain weapon is that while strength is always important, skill and precision with them can yield even better results than a more standard blade. To even bring a chainsword into contact with a softer part of the enemy is enough for the razor-sharp hooks to bite in, and they will rend and rip through, doing all the work that's needed. Debilitating an enemy with a chainsword will leave wounds so rough they often are fatal even in the best conditions, and removing limbs away from the enemy is often referred to by Imperial Guardsmen just as limbing, because whilst not immediately fatal, it often will leave the victim suffering such catastrophic blood loss, and worse still, it's often unstoppable due to the completely shredded, mangled nature of the wounds that it makes it impossible to recover. although more often than not, when in the hands of the Sororitas or Astartes, a chainsword is going to be thrust directly through an enemy, its chain teeth ripping them apart from the inside out, causing such extreme trauma that many enemies will have mere moments to live if they're still even alive as they hit the floor. The chainsword is truly the Emperor's wrath. In the galaxy of M41, in many ways these weapons define the world in which humanity finds itself. Not only are they an iconic weapon form, but also represent viscerally the inhuman savagery of the 41st millennium. The unstoppable grinding war of attrition that continues to bite, rend and eviscerate all the races of the galaxy in the far future. Much like the chainsword, the aftermath of wars in the grim dark future leave many with such gaping maws of a wound that they're beyond healing and scar them forevermore.